Well, now in the U.S., international aid is also on Trump's foreign policy chopping block. For now, a federal judge has paused a funding freeze on USAID. Tech giant Bill Gates joins Walter Isaacson to discuss how the global fight against disease could be affected by the sweeping cuts, as well as his new memoir, Source Code.
Thank you, Bianna. And Bill Gates, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
One of the things I love about this new book of yours is you dig deep into your childhood, very reflective, and you even talk about your quirky personality into details when you were young, obsessive in your own mind. And you say, if I'd been born now, I'd probably be diagnosed with on the autism spectrum. A lot of people I write about seem to have those traits and great innovators. Elon Musk and others. To what extent do you think that was actually a superpower for you?
Well, it certainly held me back in terms of my social skills. I was late to develop there, but it was a big asset in terms of taking something I was interested in and being able to put very long hours into it, whether it was math to begin with or software development. I got a lot of feedback, I got a lot of exposure. And so, by the end of this book, even though I'm still quite young, that deep interest made me a software expert.
You call your book Source Code. It's a wonderful title because it's sort of a nice metaphor for the inputs you get as a kid become part of your operating system. Let me ask you about one or two of those inputs. One of them is when your parents bring you to a psychologist, because you're not actually the nicest kid in the family, and the psychologist gives you a simple piece of advice, which is, I think, you're a lucky kid. Tell me how that informed your source code.
Yeah, I was using a lot of my mental energy to sort of plague my parents about the arbitrariness of their rules and feeling like, okay, that was some, great thing that I was able to make things a little hard for them. And the person I spent time with sort of said, no, you have an unfair advantage. It's not going to help you in the long run. They're really on your side. And so that was wonderful that he convinced me to redirect my energy and think of my parents as more positive. And so it worked better after he had flipped my focus.
You have a certain humility in this book, and there's a wonderful thing that Benjamin Franklin said that helps with humility is realizing you've been wrong at times. Tell me what realizations you had growing up that you were wrong about, and it helped you change the way you look at things.
Well, I definitely, when I first started working with other people, I was only good at working with people like myself. I believed in long hours and I was pretty harsh. And so even in these early Microsoft days where I have 20 employees, figuring out, okay, not just because you're smart at programming doesn't mean you're good at other things. It doesn't mean you're good at managing programmers. And so constantly saying, there are different types of intelligence and I have to learn how to work with all of those, even though my only natural ability is working with sort of hardcore engineers.
And were there any things that you wanted to make good for people that, like the professor that you told him he was wrong, or others where you say, okay, I got to make it good on these folks?
Yeah, there were a number of people that as I was writing the book, I was sad to hear were no longer alive. Like one of the professors had actually been nicer towards me when I got in trouble than I had realized, and written a lot of very positive things about.
Wait. How did you get in trouble?
Well, I was using the Harvard computers a lot, and there was a question of was the way I was using them, had they agreed to that or not.
You were actually writing code for the first personal computer, right?
Exactly. This basic interpreter, which I put in the public domain, and but they did in the end admonish me for bringing a non-student, Paul Allen, my co-founder, into that computer room, which was actually quite fair. But for a while, it looked like I might really get in trouble, and I hadn't realized this professor very much come to bat for me.
You had a 3-hour dinner with President Trump right after he was elected. And I remember we talked about it a little, and you said you tried to talk him into keeping some of the foreign aid, and all you really got was that he really listened to you and said maybe he'd call you before he made a final decision. Tell me what the upshot is, because he seems to have, along with Elon Musk, pretty much decimated USAID.
Well, I'm hopeful that some significant portion of that can be reversed and preserved. You know, Elon, of all the elimination he's done, 99% of it are these employees of USAID who work overseas in very tough circumstances, and they allow the U.S., in addition to our military power, to get out there and help out with famine and HIV medicines, including this program called PEPFAR. And so I know a lot of those workers. I know that work. You know, a very, very high percentage of it is stuff every taxpayer would be proud of. So there's a little bit of a discussion, you know, that, yeah, Elon, I think, said, okay, we made a mistake. We went overboard. But now, you know, what is the equilibrium? How many of those people can be capped so we can continue to save tens of millions of lives?
How many lives could be lost if they don't rectify this?
Oh, it's definitely in the millions. PEPFAR has kept over 20 million people alive with HIV drugs, you know, started by President Bush and continued on a bipartisan basis, literally up till the day that Elon decided it wasn't a good organization.
It seems almost that it's almost worse than never having done it at all if you put people on HIV and AIDS drugs and then all of a sudden, one day, they disappear.
Yeah, I think whoever was doing these software queries and finding less than 1% of these things that they were kind of, in many cases, incorrectly saying outrageous things about, I don't think they really had the picture of that hero in the field. And so, you know, keeping people alive from HIV, the U.S. Has done a great job. And, you know, even if we have to reduce that sum, an abrupt withdrawal is a terrible thing.
But there's a larger picture, which is I don't think people understand either how much we do in foreign aid or even why we do foreign aid. So leave aside the details. Why should we be giving foreign aid?
Well, most people, when they're asked, think the foreign aid is a big part of the budget, like 5%, and they think it should be more like 2%, when in fact it's actually 1%. There is the uplifting element that if these countries can get out of the poverty trap, then they participate in doing business with the U.S. They have gratitude towards the U.S. So even beyond the moral reason, maintaining stability, reducing illegal immigration, you know, we have something in common that we can help these countries. And now there's a little bit of a, you know, do they favor China over us? And because of this PEPFAR, you know, they've been very much positive towards the United States.
You know, Michael Bloomberg, when the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Accord recently, said, okay, he's going to help make up for it. Is there anything the Gates Foundation can do in this regard?
Well, USAID was giving out over $40 billion a year. And so the Gates Foundation, even as the largest philanthropy, is only about $9 billion a year. You know, there are some really unusual things like medical trials that are being interrupted that, you know, that's actually quite unethical, that we may step up in a very minor way. But there's nothing out there that can replace things like PEPFAR or the President's Malaria Initiative. It's just, these are very tight times for all donors. Other rich countries are more generous than we are as a percentage of their economy. The African countries are very indebted. So no, if this money goes away, there will be dramatic consequences.
You know, Robert Kennedy Jr., Secretary of Health and Human Services, you know, in his book, he accused you and Dr. Tony Fauci of a historic coup d'etat against Western democracy. And all the things from vaccines to COVID to pandemic that you've been interested in, how is this going to affect your ability to do what you've been doing at the Gates Foundation?
Well, the Gates Foundation is going to work with the government. The NIH is the best medical research organization in the world, just like USAID is the best aid organization. And we've done a lot with them. The pipeline of innovations that I got President Trump enthused about, including things like eventually having a gene edit for an HIV cure. And so that'll be under Robert Kennedy. So, I'm going to go meet with him and explain, why.
Has he agreed to meet with you?
I think it's very, very likely that we'll get a meeting late this month. I hope so. I'll be reaching out to him.
I noticed at the inaugurations, I'm sure you did, that all the tech bros are there in the front row. They used to be tech nerds. Now they're invited to the front row of the inauguration. What happened to the tech nerd culture to become so cool and tech bro-like? And what do you make of them all being in government now?
Well, the profit streams of these tech companies are phenomenal. I mean, these are the highest value companies in the world. And of course, the government, whether it's through the software they buy or AI regulation or antitrust, they affect these companies a lot. So, unlike when I naively thought Microsoft didn't need to be in Washington, D.C., and that was a great thing about this country. Now, all those companies have a huge presence. And so, they're playing a for-profit game. I'm no longer in that, but I can understand why they're being very responsive and trying to connect.
Do you think there's some danger of that type of tech bro mentality coming into the government?
Well, the government needs to be independent, and work on behalf of the taxpayer and the consumer. And, so there's always been a question as big business and government are aligned. It's early days here to see, how it gets managed. Issues like antitrust and government purchasing, AI regulation. So I'd say I find it fascinating. They are kind of competing to get the most attention.
When you came down here to New Orleans a couple of years ago and spoke at Tulane to my students, you talked about OpenAI, ChatGPT had just come along. And you said you were going back and working with the Microsoft teams to embed AI into it. How has that gone? What's going to be the thing we'll see coming out of that?
Well, the last 3 years since the ChatGPT large language model and many excellent competitors have come along, the progress has been pretty amazing. They still can't solve all the problems. They still have reliability issues, but the performance and that reliability is on a track that it's going to be profound how they can increase to first white-collar productivity, and then as the robots get better, all of the economy, including blue-collar as well. And so for me, I advise Microsoft, and then I take that knowledge so that the Gates Foundation can get these technologies to students in the inner city in the U.S. and to the developing countries, particularly in Africa, and not have it be a 20-year delay between usage in the rich world versus a developing world.
You've been an advisor with OpenAI and its relationship with Microsoft. What do you make of Elon Musk's sort of, to me, surprise bid to try to take back OpenAI from Sam Altman and maybe from the ownership stake of Microsoft?
Well, AI is about the most competitive space I've ever seen. Whether it's independent companies like Elon has his XAI, there's Anthropic and many others. Google and Microsoft are the two biggest companies investing not just tens, but literally hundreds of billions. And so, I think some of these maneuvers are, sort of driven by the personal relationships. But overall, I've never seen anything more competitive, which is partly why the progress we're seeing is so rapid.
Way back in 1997, in a previous century, I interviewed you for Time magazine, and I asked you if you thought there was something fundamentally different between the software of computers and the wetware of our carbon-based system and what we call consciousness. And let me went back and looked at it, and here's what you told me. You said, I don't think there's anything unique about human intelligence. All the neurons in the brain that make up perceptions and emotions operate in a binary fashion. We can someday replicate that on a machine. That was before you raised 3 kids, you watched them look at your face and recognize it. That was before ChatGPT came along. So let me ask you again, sort of the same question. Is there something fundamentally different about the way we humans can engineer AI and the way that nature or nature's God created the human mind?
Well, certainly they're not the same. But if the question is, say, take medical diagnosis or a robot doing factory work, will the quality of that factory work or that medical diagnosis from the software exceed human capacity? The answer is yes. In time, it will. Now, you'll be missing the wonderful humanness, and humans will still, with their extra time, choose to interact with each other. By and large, consciousness probably won't be there, but anything that's utilitarian, the AI will eventually surpass human capability.
You write near the end of the book that piecing together memories helps me better understand myself. What was the most interesting self-revelation that piecing together memories came?
Well, it's stunning to me how lucky I was with my dad, my mom, the time I was born, that, many times where I'd be exposed and very good software people, adults would guide me on how to improve. Just a number of those things that came together that meant at the end of this book, which is the start of Microsoft, I was in a position to see that software and having the world's best software factory, could make a huge contribution. And so, my amazement, my gratitude, my, reflecting back on friends and family was a very fulfilling exercise that humbled me in terms of all the incredible things I've gotten to experience.
Amazing, gratitude, humbling. Do you think a machine will ever be able to give that feeling?
No, feeling is a intrinsic thing that, we understand. That's like consciousness. It will be able to write words like that, but not experience the real human emotion that I did.
Bill Gates, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you.
Now, it was the moment that sent the U.S. and the world really into a panic and drew the Roaring '20s to a close. The 1929 Wall Street crash was the most devastating in history, and it eventually brought about the Great Depression. That's the focus of Andrew Ross Sorkin's new book, and he speaks to Walter Isaacson about it and what we can learn from 1929 nearly a century later.
Andrew Ross Sorkin, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Walter.
You write about the 1929 crash in this book, and you say it's one of the most largely misunderstood significant events. Why was it misunderstood?
I think there's 2 things. One is I think most Americans, unfortunately, have only a vague conception that something bad happened in 1929 and that whatever happened in 1929 led to the Great Depression. I think that's the sort of prevailing view. And by the way, was my view before I invested the last 8 years of my life in the archives writing this book. Really, the crash of 1929 was so much more because, yes, it led to the Great Depression, but the number of dominoes that did begin in 1929 and what those dominoes were, I think will surprise a lot of Americans and a lot of readers.
Does that mean that we could have had the 1929 crash, but not the Great Depression of 1930?
Oh, absolutely. So the crash in 1929, which is really only part of this book, was the first domino. And it took the next domino and the domino after that to ultimately get us to the Great Depression. But there were so many mistakes and frankly bad decisions along the way that led us to the Great Depression. And in fact, I argue that you could look at what happened even in 2008 in the financial crisis. And one of the reasons that we didn't go into a Great Depression is I like to believe that we learned at least some of, but clearly not all of the lessons.
You talk about 2008. You wrote a great book about it, Too Big to Fail, which was the Lehman Brothers collapse and the problems of 2008. What was different about 2008 than 1929?
Oh, goodness, so many things. Look, 1929, the 1920s, there was no regulations, zero. The SEC did not exist. An early reader of this book asked me, did you read the prospectuses of the companies that were public in 1929? I said, prospectuses? There were no prospectuses. Maybe there was a leaflet at best that they might have handed out on the street or at a brokerage firm trying to hawk you a stock. There were no insider trading laws. There were no capital requirements for banks. There was none of that. And so the distinction between then, 2008, and now are hopefully very, very different. I like to say I wrote this book almost as a prequel to Too Big to Fail in hopes that we don't have to ever write a sequel.
One of the common threads, though, is the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank. That had been around for 15 years, I think, by the time the 1929 crash happened. And one of your great characters, Charles Mitchell, Sunshine Charlie Mitchell, runs National City Bank. He gets put on the Fed, and there's this political push back and forth on the Fed that reminds me of today. Tell me how that was relevant.
Well, you're right. And I should say when I began writing this book, I didn't necessarily go into it thinking there were going to be so many eerie parallels to today. But one of them is this issue of the Fed. We talk oftentimes about the independence of the Fed and what the Fed should be doing. Back in 1929, they knew the market was out of control. They knew there was too much speculation, and they talked about trying to tamp it down. But there was a big question about how you do that. And they were almost overly concerned, I would argue, with the politics of the moment. As you mentioned, the Fed was new back then. It was created in 1913. And there was a view that if they tried to stamp out the speculation by raising interest rates too high, and in fact, back then, the same debate we're having now about lowering interest rates versus raising interest rates and what that's going to do to the economy, the view is if you did what, for example, Paul Volcker did in the late 70s, not only would these people lose their jobs, they thought politically, and get hauled in front of Congress, they thought the Federal Reserve might be eliminated.
You're a great triple threat in media. You have, wonderful book writer. You have the CNBC Squawk Box. You're the New York Times and Deal Book. If you were doing Deal Book or doing Squawk Box in 1929, let's say in August, what type of questions do you think you would be asking? And should we be asking those questions now?
So I think the question you'd want to be asking in 1929, and I don't know if it would have been asked, but I wish it would be, is how much leverage really is there in the system? Every financial crisis, and I think I learned this writing this book, I think I learned this covering the financial crisis in 2008 and Too Big to Fail, is a function really of only one thing. It really is leverage. It's too much credit in the system, and that is what leads to some form of speculation. 1929, it was margin loans on stock. People were literally going to brokerage houses that had sprung up on the corners of streets, the way they're like Starbucks on the corner streets, and you could put $1 down, and the brokerage would lend you $10. In 2008, it was subprime mortgages, right? And so the question for today would be, where is the leverage? And so hopefully we would have asked, is there too much leverage in 29? And today you might say to yourself, is there too much leverage and where is it?
When you talk about leverage, you're pretty much talking fundamentally about debt, right?
Debt,
People
yes.
taking on too much debt.
Too much
Consumers
debt.
taking on, the government taking on. Where is there too much debt being taken on now? And how does that compare to back in 29?
Well, it's very interesting that you say that because when you think about today, the debt, and this is something that concerns me, is a little bit out of reach. We don't know where the debt is the way we used to know where the debt is. It used to live on the balance sheet of banks. Today, most of the borrowing, especially among corporate America, is not actually from banks anymore. It's from what's called private credit vehicles. These are things that private equity firms have set up that live very much in the shadows. And so we don't really know how much debt there really is today. And there is a lot of debt that's being embedded in this whole artificial intelligence revolution that's taking place. So, hundreds of billions of dollars are being spent to build data centers, but a lot of that is being paid for with credit, with debt. And I think we need to watch that and try to better understand what's really happening.
I'm reading your book, and there's so many similarities between back then, 100 years ago, and now. Certainly an age of great technology with electricity and cars and everything being transformed. Likewise, it's a roaring jazz age, and roaring 20s comes along. Tell me about that cultural exuberance that's happening then and how that led to the crash.
Well, look, I don't know if people fully appreciate it, but prior to 1919 in America, nobody actually took on credit. Nobody took a loan because it was almost considered a moral sin to take a loan. People started doing that in 1919 because General Motors wanted to sell more cars, and they started to loan people money. And then Sears Roebuck clocked what was happening and said, well, we'll do the same now for appliances. And then Charlie Mitchell, the CEO you referred to, who runs National City, which becomes Citigroup, he says, okay, well, we can lend money to people so they can buy stocks. And the exuberance of it was a decade long. And all of these people on Wall Street and CEOs are now on the cover of magazines, Time Magazine, Forbes Magazine. They become almost cultural superstars, the way you might think of an Elon Musk or a Sam Altman or a Jamie Dimon today. And so you have this sort of remarkable period where the stock market kept going up and up and up. In 1928, the stock market was up 48%. And if you had gotten a loan from the bank to buy stock, it was like free money.
You talk about Sunshine Charlie Mitchell, you're the head of National City Bank, and saying, I think, to one of his employees, look down there, because the employee's saying, hey, we've run out of people to buy stocks. He said, there are millions of people down there. We just have to give them credit. Was that part of it, which is getting the average person in America hooked on being in the stock market?
So much of this was about, and really almost put in the banner of, we are going to democratize finance. And that has a lot of echoes about what's happening today. There's a real effort to, quote unquote, democratize finance in America today. The Trump administration recently passed a bill so that common, ordinary investors could get access to things like venture capital and private equity and private credit, things that historically were considered way too risky for the ordinary American. But there was a view that, who had access to these things? The elite, and that the elite have had great success investing in things like Uber and Facebook long before their IPOs. Well, all of that is now coming to us all over again. But it also means that we're taking some of the guardrails off the system again.
Isn't there some truth to that, though, which is the economic elites, until that got opened up in the 1920s, kind of controlled all these things?
Oh, 100%. The economic elites controlled it then, and you could argue that the economic elites control it now. I think the question is, whenever you start to take the guardrails off things, whenever you start to create new products which you sell the ordinary investor, there are some good players in all of this, but it's also when the frauds emerge. It's when the charlatans arrive. And the question is, are we watching for that?
One of the things that really struck me was, I guess, disparities of wealth, if that's a way you want to put it.
Yes.
Or just how
the
high
inequality
living.
is real.
Yeah. So tell me how that compares to today.
Very, very similar. I mean, the truth is that the inequality of the late 20s is very reminiscent of where we are today. The social unrest, interestingly, and the questions about the inequality were not as pronounced in the late 20s. And I don't know if that's a function of the way the media was at that time. And, interestingly, it really wasn't until 31, 32, and 33 where you really saw the Depression really move into full force, and Hoovervilles, which are, tented camps started to emerge, including, by the way, in Central Park, literally just blocks away from where Charlie Mitchell lived on 5th and 74th Street.
You know, Henry Ford, right after the crash happens, he's there in Detroit, of course, and he gives his workers a wage increase. He tries to make sure that what happens on Wall Street doesn't infect what happens in regular business. And he laments the fact that so much brain power is moving to Wall Street, that there are all these smart people going there instead of making real things. To what extent was that a problem that helped exacerbate the 1929 crash? Because it's certainly reminiscent of what we have today.
I think it's reminiscent of what we had today. I think it's reminiscent of really what happened in 2008, just how much Wall Street became not the backroom engine, but the front room engine of the economy. And when that happens, you know, what the true implications of that are. You know, interestingly, Henry Ford in 1929 was described as the nation's second billionaire. So Rockefeller was the first billionaire. This is not inflation adjusted, by the way, Walter. This is for real. And Henry Ford was the second billionaire in America. But you're right. He did not only try to raise the wages of his workers, he almost did it to embarrass Hoover and to embarrass the other CEOs to try to get them to raise wages. One of the things that Hoover was trying to do at the time was almost trying to jawbone his way out of this, calling this sort of a psychological problem, that if people could just sort of get over it, and if companies could pay people more. He also wanted to tax people more. And by the way, Andrew Mellon, who was our Treasury Secretary, was whispering in his ear the whole time. He was a real capitalist, saying, you know, let them eat cake. It's fine. Let them all fail. If they made poor decisions, they should fail. And so you had this sort of fascinating dynamic taking place inside Washington. And by the way, very much like today's White House, you know, Hoover was on the phone with and constantly in contact with all of these CEOs. They were literally making these pilgrimages to the White House the way they do today.
President Hoover felt that the collapse of the stock market would not necessarily affect business in America. Why was he wrong?
Well, this is, you know, oftentimes we say, look at the stock market, look at the real economy, and we think that they're somehow not connected to each other at all. The reason why it was connected today, but I would argue it was perhaps even more connected then, was because so many ordinary investors, so many ordinary Americans had taken on so much debt in the stock market, so that when the stock market fell, it wasn't just that they lost money and that the stocks they had bought at $10 were now worth $1. It was that they had taken on so much debt that they now owed so much money. And because they owed so much money, they couldn't buy basic goods. That's why they had Hoovervilles. And so it really did spiral out of control to the point in which in 1933, 9,000 banks faltered. They failed in 1933. And that is really, I think, a direct domino, if you will, from what happened in fall of 1929.
The last third or so of your book is actually after October 1929. It's about the Depression, why all of this happens, why it affects business. And then, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes in. What does he do?
Well, he does a whole bunch of things, some of which actually Hoover wanted to do, but for whatever reason decided not to or felt he couldn't. And one of the things that he does is he has what's called a national bank holiday. So he actually shutters all of the banks in the United States and then tries to prop up the ones that actually he believes are strong enough. And then enacts, you know, a series of legislation, including the Glass-Steagall piece of legislation separating the gambling piece from the banking piece, but also creating the FDIC so that your money that goes inside a bank is insured. And then later in 1934 creates the SEC, which really oversees and regulates the stock market, the idea of insider trading and manipulation, which, by the way, which is a huge component of what was happening in 1929. So much of the stock market was being manipulated oftentimes by the elites.
I must say that when I finished your book, I was like, all right, I got to sell stocks. And I'm not a big stock speculator. It was like, oh my God, this could happen again. It's such a frightening book. To what extent do you think it could happen again? And to what extent do you think you might provoke it slightly if people read this book?
Well, I'm hoping not to provoke it. I'm actually hoping that to the extent that people read this book, they take away some lessons. I hope policymakers better understand what happened in 1929 so that we can take away lessons so this doesn't happen again. It does not have to happen again. We are not destined to have this happen again. It is true. I do think that the train, if you will, is careening towards some form of a crisis at some point. The problem is you'll never know. We're always living in a bubble of some sort, and it will pop at some point too. What we want to do, though, is prevent it from popping in such a way that it creates the next Great Depression. And I think that can be avoided. The truth is we've actually managed to avoid that ever since then. Yes, we've had crises. 1999 dot-com bubble was a crisis. 2008 was a crisis. But here we are, Walter, and we're better for it. And in many ways, I think, we've had more and more innovation. AI, I think, is very exciting and will be here for as long as I can imagine. Will we have a hiccup along the way? I imagine we will. But let's hope that's all it is.
Andrew Ross Sorkin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Walter. So appreciate it.
Next to the ubiquitous yet harmful ultra-processed food. Dhruv Kula is a physician and contributing writer for The New Yorker. He's been investigating the dangers in our diets and spoke to Hari Srinivasan about his findings.
Thanks, Dr. Dhruv Kula. Thanks so much for joining us. You wrote a piece in The New Yorker recently that is titled, "Why is the American Diet So Deadly?" And, it would seem like as you dive into all of the research that there should be some sort of a simple answer, but there isn't. Why?
It's a really complicated issue. One of the things that we're really starting to learn more and more about almost every day is the idea of ultra-processed foods. And that's a really broad category. It's one that, we've only really had in our lexicon for the past 15 years or so. But our diet, the American diet, has among the most ultra-processed foods in the entire world. And so if you think about how we compare, about 60 to 70% of our diet is considered ultra-processed. It might be half in France or a third in Spain. And so we really are an outlier in this way, and our rates of chronic disease and obesity track with that.
So can we just get kind of a definition on the table? What's processed? What's ultra processed? What, if I'm looking around through my pantry or my refrigerator, how do I know the difference?
Yeah, it's a great question. So people generally have a sense that ultra-processed foods, they sound just like bad food or junk food, but there's actually a very specific scientific definition. And so if you think about ultra-processed foods, you start at the very bottom. So most foods, when they come out of nature, are unprocessed or minimally processed. So you think about eggs or nuts or vegetables, and these are group 1 foods, and those are generally considered natural and healthy. Then we get to group 2, which is kind of culinary ingredients. And so salt, butter, fat, sugar, these types of things. If you add the first group to the second group, you get the third group, and that's considered a processed food. Almost all the food that we have is processed in some way. You think about just buttering and salting your pasta. That's now a processed food. Doesn't mean that it's a bad food. What we're talking about here is that fourth group 4 foods, and that means that it has using unnatural ingredients or unnatural processes to get there. And so a lot of these foods have high fructose corn syrup or hydrogenated oils or certain emulsifiers or thickeners, additives of all sorts. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about ultra processed foods. But it's a very broad category. And so everything from gummy bears to canned kidney beans might fall into this one category. And so we really need to be thoughtful about what are we talking about when we say ultra processed foods are harming our health.
So what is the actual effect on our health when we take on these ultra-processed foods? Is it our ability to digest it or how we store it? I mean, you looked at really fascinating research, which actually had people eat pretty weird diets as much as they wanted for days on end.
Yeah. So it's a great question, and we're just starting to get really rigorous research on this. So the first kind of set of research that put this on the map was broad-scale survey research. And so you might survey thousands or hundreds of thousands of people and say people who eat more ultra-processed foods tend to have higher rates of cardiovascular disease or dementia or any number of conditions. But what studies are doing now is they're bringing people into the lab to try to figure out, hey, if you're giving people 80 or 90% ultra-processed foods versus very little ultra-processed foods, what happens inside their body? The headline finding here is that people tend to eat many, many more calories on an ultra-processed diet than on an unprocessed diet. And so some of the studies that we've seen, 500 more calories a day, 800 more calories a day, say, on an ultra processed diet versus an unprocessed diet. So that's the headline finding. And underneath that, there's all sorts of interesting, provocative early findings. Does it change our microbiome in some way, the bacteria in our gut? Does it change our hormone levels and cause us to feel more hungry? Does it change our taste buds, for instance? Are we more likely to crave salt and sugar and other things that are unnatural because we're so used to ultra processed foods and the kind of the high hit of those things that they offer? And so those are the things that are still a little bit speculative. We're figuring them out. But the headline finding seems to be that we just eat more calories when we're on an ultra processed diet than when we're on a minimally processed diet.
When you look at the longer arc of how long humans have been on the planet and eating food, right, this is almost a blink of an eye in the terms of when ultra-processed foods were manufactured and kind of introduced into our diets. And there are still societies on the planet who have far less of this than you and I might have access to today, right? Are there ways that we can compare, culturally or geographically to say, hey, that we kind of know that if you're on a little bit more of a holistic, maybe, Mediterranean diet, or maybe it's just less processed, that your health outcomes are better?
That generally seems to be the case. And so countries that have had a more traditional diet, that haven't had this industrialization of their food system, tend to have lower rates of obesity. Actually, the researcher that put this whole idea on the map was a researcher named Carlos Monteiro in Brazil. And what he found was he was tracking, what are people buying when they go to the grocery store? He had all these receipts, and he found that people are buying less salt, less sugar, less fat. So he's thinking, how are we having this explosion of obesity? And what he realized is that people just basically aren't buying those things. They're just getting them packaged in foods that are coming to them that are ultra processed. And so it's not just thinking about those specific ingredients or specific nutrients, but how are they packaged? What are the other additives that are going to these things? Why do they have such long shelf lives? Obviously, these preservatives allow for that. And those types of things are having a real impact on the way that we're able to live our lives and to put food on the table.
So many of us have tried to listen or watch the food pyramid guidelines, or whether it's the healthy meal plate that the FDA or the Department of Agriculture might recommend, like how we eat. We've been told it's about counting calories, and then we're told it's not, all calories are not equal, right? I mean, what are some kind of simple guidelines that people can use to figure out how to moderate their consumption, maybe how to consume more of the healthy and less of the unhealthy?
Yeah, I think that the most important advice I could get is, as much as you can cook your own food, the better you'll be, right? So the things that you will never put as much salt and sugar and fat and cholesterol in your own food as, a restaurant or a fast food joint will put in your food. And so my number one recommendation is, to the extent that you can cook your food, prepare it yourself, all the better. Not everyone has the time or the convenience, the ability to do that. A lot of fresh foods can be pricey. They're not readily available. And so from there, I think about how we can minimize the processing in what we're eating. And so there's a big difference between an ultra processed yogurt, let's say, that has one specific emulsifier that's improving the mouthfeel of that yogurt, versus Doritos or something that is like very heavily processed. And so I think keeping to things that are less processed on that entire spectrum of processing. And I always go back to Michael Pollan's famous adage, which is basically eat real food, not too much, mostly plants. And I think if you can stick to those 6 or 7 words, that'll get you a lot of the way there.
Well, how much of this has a social dimension to it, right? Like I'm thinking right now, if you gave me the zip code of someone in a test cohort, I could probably give you a pretty decent guess as to whether or not that population has high rates of heart disease or diabetes, just based on their poverty level, right? And whether or not they have access to, whether they live in a food desert, whether like the corner bodega is really the only place that they're getting their food.
Yeah, I think you're getting at an incredibly important point, which is we make some decisions about our food, but a lot of the decisions that we're able to make are influenced by economics, by our social status, by politics, and so all these things kind of come together to produce a food environment, and the food environment around us dictates a lot of the options that we'll have. And so the first step, I think, is to educate people, to help them understand how to make healthy decisions about their lives. But we also need to move upstream and talk with policymakers foods. There are things that we can do to change the subsidies in this country that subsidize some of the junk food, things like corn and soy that end up as preservatives in our food. There are potentially restrictions on certain types of marketing, especially for children. People have talked about getting ultra processed foods out of schools, which I think is a good idea. And so there are things that we can do at a higher level to try to shape the environment in which people can make healthier decisions for themselves.
Well, we're having this conversation as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been picked to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And one of the things that we heard before and during his confirmation was that there is some bipartisan interest in some of the things that he's talking about in terms of getting ultra-processed foods out of school lunches and so forth. Now, there's got lots of other sort of controversial viewpoints that he has on lots of things, but I wonder whether or not this administration or any administration really has a chance at trying to decrease this, given that most of the companies that are making these ultra-processed foods are also very active in lobbying for their interests.
It's such a good point. And, one thing that is important about this whole conversation is that we're talking about it. It's on the map now in a way that it wasn't a few years ago. I mean, people have been concerned about chronic disease and obesity, but as you mentioned, there's real movement behind particularly the idea of ultra-processed foods, but more generally trying to reduce rates of chronic disease in this country. And I think where we can make common cause across the aisle, we should definitely pursue those options. It's hard to say how much progress we'll be able to make without having very specific proposals for what we're going to be able to do. But the idea that people at the highest levels of government are now concerned and talking about this in a really passionate way, I think bodes well for the potential, at least, to make progress on this issue.
So what are the counter arguments? What have you heard from the food companies in kind of slowing this system down? Because clearly they're motivated by selling more of whatever it is that you're buying and making more profits. But what do they say doesn't need to be changed? Is it really just about individual responsibility? And look, I don't control what you put into your mouth.
Well, as you're hinting at, eating less is very bad for business. And so these businesses want you to eat more. They want you to consume more calories, to buy more chips, to buy more junk food, whatever it might be. And so I think there's a couple of things to think about, not just the food companies, but there are legitimate concerns among researchers that ultra-processed foods is an incredibly broad category. I mean, it covers a huge swath of things from whole grain, breads and yogurts, all the way to sugary beverages, processed meats. And so I think one step that we need to do is to try to figure out what within this huge consortium of foods is actually the most harmful. I think what the research is showing is that if I could limit anything, it would be sugar-sweetened beverages and processed meats. Those two things have probably the highest level of evidence regarding their harmful effects on the human body. So I think that's a good place to start, both in terms of educating people about it, but also nudging food companies away from those types of products. Look, I mean, the food companies are going to try to sell as much food as they can. And so what we need to do is try to shape demand for some of these things. And some of that will happen through education, but some of that, we're already seeing through things like GLP-1 drugs and Ozempic. People's preferences are starting to change. And over time, it's possible that could turn the food system into a different direction that would be more helpful for everyone.
Do you see that? I mean, either in your practice or anecdotally, or I guess there's probably data out there. What's the longer term arc of what the GLP-1 drugs could not just be doing to the population that's taking them, but the entire food industry that's catering to all of us?
Absolutely. I mean, these drugs have been incredibly effective for so many people, including a lot of my patients. I've seen them, people who have struggled all their life, tried one diet after another to try to lose weight, are now able to really lose weight and keep it off in a way that they never were able to do. And it's not just about weight. I mean, these things have really helpful and salubrious benefits for cardiovascular health, for liver health, for kidney disease. We're seeing suggestions that they may help with things like addictive behaviors. And so I think these are really important drugs. There's also kind of more general, but as you're hinting at, there's the potential to have a more general effect where people who aren't taking the drugs, there could be indirect positive effects as companies, whether it's alcohol companies, tobacco companies, the food industry, change and reformulate their products because the demand that used to be there is no longer there in the same way.
Are there any countries on the planet, so to speak, doing this well or better? Because you see often comparisons to Europe that, myself included, when we travel overseas, you feel like the fries taste different at a McDonald's in London than they do at a McDonald's here.
There are. So a lot of countries in Europe do not have the level of ultra processed foods that we have in the American diet. And so if you look at certain European countries, it might be half as much or a third as much in terms of the overall food supply that is ultra processed. A lot of this movement grew out of South America, Brazil, and surrounding countries. And so those countries have taken even more aggressive approaches towards ultra processed food. So some companies have tried to limit marketing of ultra processed foods, particularly to minors. Others are starting to introduce taxes on the worst types of ultra processed food. So there are these policy levers at policymakers' disposal. We'll see how aggressive they want to be. I think building the evidence base for some of these policy changes is going to be really important. The stronger evidence that we have, the more forthright we can be about the policy recommendations. But for now, I think, moving forward with helping people understand the potential risks of consuming these types of products, I think is the best first step.
So how do we kind of get smarter in that way, where we might be seeing, well, I guess in this case, disinformation, because it's actively and intentionally trying to disinform us so that we make a certain kind of purchase. But, how do we navigate this? How do we become food literate enough so that we can tell what's something that we should avoid from not?
Yeah, I think helping people understand what is going in their mouth, what is on their plates, where their food is coming from, is so important. Empowering them to make decisions that are going to be good for their long-term health, I think, is going to be really important. What's so exciting, I think, about this potential movement is that it is bipartisan. So many of the things that are going on in our country have become politicized, and there's real division around, particularly things around public health. This is an area where still the left and the right and the center agree that chronic disease in the United States is a big problem. Most people agree that our diet is contributing in a substantial way to those rates of chronic disease, and people are motivated to make a change. And so I think it's a place where there is potential to make real progress.
So what is the kind of rule that you go by in your household, right? You are kind of in an average family, you have kids, you've got a busy schedule. You write that, ironically, when you were a resident, you were counseling people on diabetes and eating better, and yet you're taking processed foods in the hospital cafeteria.
Yeah, I think, I shared that anecdote just to suggest, how difficult it is really to avoid ultra processed foods, to avoid foods that aren't good for you. I'm here counseling people with heart disease or diabetes to eat healthier. And here I am. It's very difficult for even someone with knowledge and experience to find food that's consistently healthy. In our house, we try our best to cook every evening or to prepare food at the beginning of the week and eat it over the course of the week. Of course, we order in and we give into fries and pizza from time to time. But again, the most important thing that I want to try to instill in my family and my children is that if you could prepare your own food, it's almost always going to be healthier than anything you buy in a restaurant or at a fast food restaurant.
Dr. Dhruv Kular, contributing writer to The New Yorker, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, from a tariff war, as we discussed earlier in the program, to tax cuts for the rich, is there method in Trump's MAGA-nomics? Our next guest thinks so, and he's calling it his, quote, weapon of mass distraction. NYU professor, entrepreneur, and podcast host Scott Galloway joins Hari Srinivasan to break down what Trump's head-spinning, constantly shifting economic policies mean for the state of American finances.
Christian, thanks. Scott Galloway, thanks for being back with us. Last time you and I spoke, we were talking about your book, Adrift. And at that time, you said, America as a country isn't lost, but rather adrift and unmoored. And I wonder, since that time, has your assessment changed?
Well, you could argue that it's found direction. Unfortunately, I think the direction is more a direction around change towards a quarter of each party. Democrats are just as guilty of this as Republicans, are in favor of an autocrat as long as that autocrat shares their views. And I think that's sort of come to fruition here. I think the superseding of our checks and balances of different branches of government, such that one political party that is in control can sort of bypass the traditional constitutional measures or safeguards, reflects that America has become, if you will, more open or accepting to the notion of an autocracy. I think we are pretty much in a full kind of, call it maybe most generously, autocracy light, and much of America voted for this.
Do you think that, say, for example, what's happening in the stock market is a reflection of people's dissatisfaction with this direction that you're talking about? I mean, I think the S&P's had one of its worst weeks ever. All the gains that we had since the election have practically been wiped out.
I wouldn't say it's dissatisfaction, because that implies that they're upset about it. The market is pretty unemotional and is focused on increasing earnings, and people will buy stocks regardless. Sentiment sort of takes a backseat to financial considerations. I think what's happening in the market is, first off, you have to acknowledge that even with these drawdowns, the market is still substantially up from where it was just 6 months ago. It has come back from pre-election. The Trump bump has been wiped out. I think what you're seeing, quite frankly, is a couple of things. The market just may have gotten, quite frankly, overvalued. But I think the thing that kind of triggered the sell-off, if you will, is what appears to be irrational, non-economic decisions around tariffs, where we're basically ripping up these 80-year-long alliances with trusted economic partners that engage in mutually beneficial trade, and that these are not only a bad idea in the specific agreements we're wrapping up, but America is losing a very important brand association for economic relationships or geopolitical negotiations, and that is one of consistency.
You know, there was an estimate by the Yale Budget Lab that these tariffs are going to cost average households somewhere between $1,600 and $2,000 every year. It's also estimated to reduce our GDP as much as $110 billion a year. You know, and one of the lines of thinking that I hear from members of the administration is, look, if these short-term hits can get us better leverage to try to negotiate longer-term prosperity for America, this will have been worth it. Does that make sense?
Well, to be fair, tariffs aren't all bad. Sometimes you need tariffs as a hammer to restore symmetry to an asymmetric trade relationship. Biden maintained the initial Trump tariffs. I think some of Trump's initial instincts around the asymmetry of the trading relationship between China and the U.S. were accurate. What this is, though, is just plain non-economic. I was a graduate student instructor in microeconomics in graduate school. We used to talk about tariffs, I imagine, the same way that professors in medical school talk about leeches. Like, can you believe they were stupid enough to actually think this would work? And the notion that we're putting ourselves in a position to negotiate some big, beautiful deal, I don't think it's going to work, because Trump tore up the Iran deal and now appears to want it again. The tariffs are off and on. I just don't think we're seen now as a reliable partner that can be counted on with the economic livelihood of your country. Think about Canada. We're not even able to give Canada a good reason for why he's doing this. The kind of the stated reason from the administration for what is tariffs that will hurt our economy and dramatically hurt the Canadian economy is that the unchecked transfer of fentanyl across the Canadian border. You could take the amount of fentanyl that's come across the U.S.-Canadian border and put it in a backpack. Estimates are that it's less than 1%. And to alienate your closest allies, think about Canada, Ari. It's the largest undefended border in the world. What does that tell you about our relationship to this point with Canada? They joined us in World War I. They were in World War II before us, training Allied pilots. They were side by side with us in Kosovo in our fights against the Taliban. Amazing economic prosperity. We have NBA and NHL teams in America and in Canada, respectively. And I love that question, Hari, that was presented by a Holocaust survivor around evaluating who are your real friends. And that is, it comes down to one question for her. Would they hide me? And that's a really puncturing, kind of rattling question to evaluate your friends by. But by that standard, Canada is one of our best friends. In the Iran hostage crisis, they hid American diplomats and under great personal risk ensured their safe escape from Iran. And they stayed behind. And had they been caught, there was a good chance they would have been hanged from cranes. So Canada has hid us. They are real friends. And for us to recklessly, irrationally, and inexplicably try to hurt them in exchange for what might be some big, beautiful deal, the damage here to unwind and repair will take the better part of the 80 years it took to make these amazing, prosperous relationships that, quite frankly, the administration, in my view, is irrationally taken for granted.
So how does the world deal with this kind of uncertainty?
So the VIX, which measures volatility as evidenced by trading and options, has spiked. And the Atlanta Fed has a metric for trying to project what GDP growth might look like in the coming year. In the last 45 days, it's gone from a projected growth of GDP of 4%, which is really robust growth, to negative 2.8. The economy is contracting faster than it has since the COVID lockdowns. Obviously, the markets are chilled. I think the silver lining here, I always like to ask myself, what could go right? Because over the medium and the long term, the majority of the metrics in the world do get better. And it's easy for someone like me to try and sound smarter than they are by always being negative. So I think it's an important question to say, what could go right? And I think the silver lining here is that Europe is in fact becoming a union because they realize they can no longer count on the military, economic umbrella or the geopolitical consistency of America. America spends about $800 billion. NATO and all EU nations spend about $430 on the military. And quite frankly, they have gotten, I would call, lazy and expectant around the military umbrella being provided by the U.S. They now are convinced they can no longer count on the U.S. to be pro-democracy and make what are rational decisions and honor this kind of post-World War II order. They realize they can no longer count on or expect the military umbrella of the U.S. They will dramatically increase their spending on military, which I think will have stimulative and spillover effects. I think the silver lining here is that Europe is going to begin to command the space it occupies. Keep in mind the total GDP of European nations is 19 trillion. The GDP of Russia is 2 trillion. So there's no reason why Europe, if it gets its act together, shouldn't be able to push back and be a credible opposing threat to an economy that is, again, smaller than the size of Canada, Russia.
You've been pointedly critical of Elon Musk in the past several months and really even a couple of years. But in light of the Department of Government Efficiency, I think there is a consensus that people on both sides of the aisle are interested in making government function better, making it more responsive and efficient. But what have you seen over the past couple of months that give you pause on whether this is going to have longer-term effects and perhaps unintended consequences?
Well, every administration from Clinton Gore has had some sort of task force to try and root out inefficiency, fraud, and waste. So far, if DOGE is an audit of the U.S. government, then the U.S. government has been issued a clean bill of health because this wall of receipts is surprisingly scant. The first one said claimed they were saving $8 billion. It ended up to be $8 million of spending that had already been spent. And then numbers 2, 3, and 4 on the list of DOGE receipts that have since been taken down were just blatantly false. The Wall Street Journal reports that so far DOGE has found $2.6 billion in cost savings. You could 6x the savings from DOGE to date by cutting off all subsidies to Tesla, which has cost taxpayers $15 billion. But I think it's more mendacious than that, Ari. I mean, yeah, we all like the idea of cutting waste, but I believe it's a misdirect. And that is, while we're all kind of have our hair on fire and looking over here at DOJA, $2.6 billion, the indignance, the emotional upset of firing good people doing good work, or just the general incompetence of laying off air traffic controllers or firing people overseeing our nuclear stockpile and then trying to hire them back. I believe for the most part, it's a strategic weapon of mass distraction to get you to look over here as the Trump administration is planning to increase our deficit by $800 billion a year with tax cuts to the wealthy. All of this is a misdirect. It's sad. It's unfortunate. It's incompetent. These savings are illusory, right? But at the end of the day, I think it's a purposeful distraction from the tax cuts they are trying to put forward at the expense of future generations.
Do you think that Elon is getting a net positive benefit from this? Because on the one hand, he has gained incredible proximity to power and, in fact, power for his $250 million contribution to the campaign. On the other hand, the value from Tesla shares have been evaporating because he seems to have alienated a huge chunk of the people that used to buy his cars.
I think the political calculus here was miscalculated on his part. We were talking about Nike off mic. When Nike embraced Colin Kaepernick, which was a political position, they had done the math, and that is 2/3 of their revenue comes from people outside of the U.S. or people under the age of 30, none of whom thought the U.S. had it right on race relations. So they purposely tickled the censors or cemented their kind of progressive ideology among a customer base that they knew would appreciate that. Musk has made exactly the wrong calculation, and that is 3/4 of Republicans would never consider buying an EV anyway. His largest market is California, and sales are down 11%. In Europe, sales are off 75% in Germany and between 20 and 30 in other big EU markets. So essentially, Tesla has shed 1/3 of its value in the last month. It's given back all of its gain since the Trump election. What is really going to hurt his pocketbook is that it has now jumped the lab and is now starting to infect SpaceX, specifically Starlink, who is seeing contracts being canceled by people ranging from Canada to Poland is saying, we can't count on you for something as important as communications and battlefield communications technology. So they're reconsidering their Starlink contract. So I would argue the political calculus here from Mr. Musk was wildly inaccurate, and he is seeing a lot of his wealth evaporate because the negative associations of Musk are starting to infect not only the Tesla brand, but also the SpaceX brand. So I think it was an irrational decision from a purely economic standpoint.
Here we were at the inauguration, and we saw lined up next to the president, literally the who's who of technology and billionaires standing next to him. And I wonder, is this just business as usual? Or was it, is this different than what the Carnegies or the Rockefellers might have done 100 years ago? Is it just the optics that are different now? Or is there something more structurally more destructive?
It's a fair question, because I think a lot of people on the right would maybe fairly say, look, we may be more transparent and brazen about it, but it's nothing that lobbyists and lawyers and the media have been doing for the left. They've just done it more quietly and elegantly. When the most powerful or wealthy tech executives in the world are all willing to be intimidated into donating to an inaugural campaign, which they didn't do in 2020, despite publicly stating their politics were more in line with Biden than Trump, when they're willing to be paraded around for the benefit of the Trump administration, you have what I'd call a domino of cowardice. And that is, they text my Pivot co-hosts that they hate themselves and that they hate showing up in the inauguration, and then they show up. And then that gives Linda Yaccarino, the CEO of X, the confidence to demand that an ad agency advertise on their platform, or they risk having their merger blocked by her buddy who has proximity to the president. What we don't want to acknowledge in America is that rights and democracy are now a function of how much money you have, full stop. The wealthy technocrats and the 0.1% feel as if, and quite frankly, it may be true, that they are protected by the law, but not bound by it. Whereas the rest of the 99% are bound by the law, but not protected by it.
I wonder, getting back to those CEOs for a second, I wonder if they now or will always have a shield that says, hey, listen, I'm just doing what's right for my shareholders. This is my fiduciary responsibility. So I give $1 million to the campaign or to the inauguration. You know what? It could help our stock down the line. Or if I don't give the $1 million, it could certainly hurt my stock down the line. And that's, as CEO, that's who I'm supposed to, be loyal to.
I think that's a fair argument, Hari. But what I would ask is they don't ever use the term stakeholders again. Remember all this BS over the last 10 years where they start talking about stakeholders? Well, all right, the country, democracy, poor people, people who aren't politically connected, people who don't have stock options in Apple, the 99% that only own 10% of stocks. Are you supposed to also be representing them? Are you supposed to have some fidelity to the values, the rule of law, democracy, checks and balances that helped get you so rich in the first place? Because let me list all of the CEOs who have filled this leadership void and have said, I am more concerned about the long-term health of America and what it means for private and public companies, and I'm not going to engage in this sort of this kleptocracy. I'm not going to be an agent. So here are some of the CEOs who have filled this leadership void. Okay, list over. At some point, these people, many of whom talk about running for president, many of whom claim to be great Americans, many of whom constantly voice their gratitude for what is the best experiment and the best platform in the world for establishing economic security and rights. At some point, you'd like to think they're going to show some fidelity to the democracy and principles and rule of law and checks and balances that played a huge role in their wealth. But instead, they default to this, quite frankly, cold comfort of, well, I'm a fiduciary for shareholders. Let's be honest, just kiss his ass, give him $1 million and stay out of the crosshairs. Yeah, it's probably good in the short term. The question is, at what point does someone stand up and say, okay, I'm representing the bottom 99%, I'm representing democracy, and I'm representing what America is supposed to stand for, and paying it forward based on the incredible rule of law, democracy, fair competition that got me here in the first place. So I think the domino of cowardice here in the private sector is not only shocking, it's just very disappointing.
Author and professor and podcast host of both Prof G and Pivot, Scott Galloway. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Hari. Always good to see you.
Next to Washington, D.C., where a government shutdown is about to enter its fifth week. Negotiations remain at a standstill. The debate over health care funding for undocumented immigrants, one of the main sticking points between Democrats and Republicans. And according to our next guest, it's a debate riddled with misleading claims. Washington Post reporter David Ovalle tells Hari Srinivasan that his latest article is setting the record straight.
Bianna, thanks. David Ovalle, thanks so much for joining us. You wrote a piece recently, which was very simply titled, Here's Who Pays When Undocumented Immigrants Get Health Care in America. And this is literally the center of why the federal government is shut down right now. You have Republicans saying that Democrats want to have, undocumented people get free health care. And Democrats saying that's just not the way that law works today. And you point out exactly what's happening.
I think it's definitely an issue that's very nuanced and very gray, and it does not fit neatly into the narratives that really either side are putting out there in terms of what's going on with the healthcare debate. But the reality is taxpayers do pay some for directly and indirectly for care for undocumented people, but it is neither as glaring and as stark as Republicans might have you believe, and some of the talking points that are going on right now, or the debate about the shutdown.
Okay, so the Democrats say, look, that's just not how the law works. You can't get health care in America if you aren't documented. That said, if an undocumented human being walks into an emergency room because their arm is broken, they're going to get health care in America. Who pays for that?
Right. So at the end of the day, the Republicans have really zeroed in on emergency Medicaid. Now, what's interesting about emergency Medicaid is all of this stems from laws that were passed in the 80s under President Reagan that basically said you cannot deny someone emergency coverage at the emergency room if they come in. And obviously, there's the basic human element, right? We don't want people not being able to be treated for something like a car crash or for a fall or for some emergency thing. So there is the emergency Medicaid program, which if you are otherwise eligible for Medicaid, then you can get coverage the hospitals can get reimbursed for the services that are provided. Okay, so this is going to be for that very narrow emergency room visit, right? So this may pay for your broken arm if you fall on a construction site, right? But it's not going to pay for the rehabilitation visits. It's not going to pay for the ongoing care that you might need afterward. So it's really, emergency Medicaid is less than 1% of all Medicaid spending. So it's, compared to the vast majority of spending that is done for primarily U.S. citizens, it is a very, very small amount of money. But it is something that is explicitly built into law that allows for federal funds to pay for emergency care for people without papers.
So if it's less than 1%, the Republicans also talk about kind of the number that you hear in the press is $200 billion, that if the provisions are kind of reinstated, basically the big beautiful bill rolled back some of these kind of extensions of tax credits. If these tax credits come back in, $200 billion. Where's that number from?
Well, there's a lot of conflation that's going on and a lot of the claims that are going back and forth. And so one of the things that I think is important for people to understand is the Trump administration has really zeroed in on people that it believes should never have been afforded any kind of legal status to begin with under the Biden administration, right? So these are going to be people that got protection under TPS programs, under other immigration programs. And so this was a lot of people that came into the United States and were given some sort of legal status. For the Republicans, they say, well, these are people that should have never gotten any kind of protections. And so therefore, the health care that they are afforded because of that legal status should not be afforded to them. So there's sort of some conflation going on there, because it's not really the undocumented population that we think of that it just snuck across the border and is living and working here. These are people that came in, have had some sort of legal status. Some of it's in limbo, right? We have hundreds of thousands of people from countries that are in sort of legal limbo right now because their TPS programs have been pulled back. But there are a lot of people that would fall under this bucket, right? So some of these numbers get a little bit conflated. But what the big beautiful bill did was it tightened eligibility for a lot of these programs. So some of those people are now no longer eligible for any of these federal healthcare programs. Yeah. And so what rolling back some of those provisions in the big beautiful bill would do is give those people back some of that coverage.
Got it. You spoke to individuals who are getting health care or not getting health care in America, along with the providers, the clinics, and so forth in the story. One of the things that you point out is the more common experience for millions of people living in the United States illegally is that they often forego routine medical appointments, pay out of pocket for specialized care, rely on community clinics, and turn to emergency rooms as a last resort, according to healthcare providers and immigrant advocates. How does someone who doesn't have papers in America just kind of navigate normal life, whether it's the common cold or flu, or whether ultimately getting to that kind of broken arm example?
Look, healthcare in America is complicated for citizens, right? Just navigating whether you have healthcare, whether you don't have healthcare, whether you have some mix of charity care and government-backed help. But at the end of the day, it's just as difficult and then some for people without papers. So I think community clinics tend to be sort of the go-to places for a lot of people without papers, and people who just don't have money, people who are impoverished. So this will be for very common preventative type things, right? You have a cold, you have, maybe you need blood pressure medication, maybe you're diabetic. And so you go to these, especially like in rural areas and underserved areas where there is just, not that much access to healthcare. Those provide a real crucial place for people to get healthcare. And what's interesting about that is that there's, most of them are required by law to serve whoever is in their local area, right? Regardless of whether they're eligible or not, or whether they have any kind of documented status, right? So that is built into the law. Now, the Trump administration has been trying to pull back on some of the funding that goes toward these types of programs. But again, that also, a lot of that money comes from the state or is federal money that's routed through the state, right? So it's not always as clear cut as federal taxpayer money is funneling down to community clinics. That's really, it's a lot more complicated than that. But that is one way. And even then, undocumented immigrants still pay for some of their care, for a lot of their care. And moreover, they want to pay for a lot of their care. If you read my story, I spoke to a medical director at a clinic here in South Florida where I'm based, and she pointed out that a lot of the undocumented immigrants are used to paying for healthcare in their home countries, and they don't want to come here and just, feel like they're leeching off the government. They want to pay at least something for some of their care. So a lot of it is done on a sliding scale. So you come in, you're going to pay, maybe only $55, $60 for a visit, and the medications will be much more, right? And so a lot of this can get kind of complicated and messy for people. And a lot of times they'll just forego the care, right? If they have something, then they'll just go buy, over-the-counter Tylenol or medications for your common cold or whatever. And oftentimes they just don't go unless it's absolutely an emergency.
I wonder if the people that you spoke with, are they foregoing care that could be preventing further costs down the line?
And that's one of the things that doctors and public health officials and immigrant advocates stress is that if we are cutting off care on the preventative side, it ends up costing taxpayers more when they do go to emergency rooms, right? When there is a complication from diabetes or there is a complication from cardiovascular disease, by not treating it on the front end, we're actually going to increase the cost on the back end. And I think where we're going to see that take place a lot is in some of the immigration enforcement that's going on. So that's sort of separate from all the debate about taxpayer money going, but you're having a lot of people without papers or questionable papers, or maybe people who live in mixed families. So maybe they're undocumented, but their kids are citizens. And so a lot of them are just foregoing the care because they are afraid of going out. They are afraid of getting targeted by immigration enforcement. And I've spoken to people at different community clinics who said, yeah, we've had people skip surgeries. We've had people not just skipping appointments because they are genuinely terrified of going out. So that is going to play out in, when you have, these health conditions that start getting worse. And then ultimately, when there's no remedy, then those people are going to end up going to emergency care. So there is a lot of consternation about that. And that's something that we may end up seeing play out down the road.
Are there particular regions or particular industries that affect the type of healthcare needs that some of the undocumented in the United States have?
Well, yeah. If you think about a lot of the jobs that undocumented people have now, right? That are jobs that Americans that are citizens are more reluctant to take, right? This is farm workers. Farm workers are outside. They are going to be exposed to more sun. We might have more sunstroke. You might have a region like I spoke to a clinic director, a clinic CEO in the Central Valley in California, where there's a lot of pollution in the air. And so that leads to things like asthma and respiratory conditions. You're going to have people who are doing very physical work, right? Think about the physical toll that is taken at a poultry plant, right? At a processing plant in Georgia or somewhere else in the South where there are a lot of undocumented people working. Those places are going to be very taxing on your hands, on your limbs, or there's going to be accidents that happen. So these are very physical jobs that require just a lot of exertion, and ultimately there's a physical price to be paid for a lot of these jobs. So yeah, I think it's going to be certainly a factor. Now,
immigrants tend to not use as much healthcare. They tend to be more healthy in working age. A lot of the research has shown that. But at the end of the day, it's still a lot of industries that are just going to be more prone to health conditions.
So, is there anything that you've discovered so far in your research that indicates that there's a way through this? I mean, because on the one hand, you see, just from a number standpoint, look, if these are subsidies that exist for certain populations and ideologically want to roll these back, that seems like a non-starter. And then on the other hand, you kind of have people who are saying, look, this is, structurally not the way that healthcare is designed. But if there are any government funds going, it's because that's also part of the law that people have to get care in emergency rooms, right? So it just seems like there's a pretty big gap here as we all live through this government shutdown.
Yeah, and I think some of this is a lot of this is going to go on even when the shutdown is resolved, right? I mean, one of the things that the Big Beautiful Bill did was it changed the ratio of how much the federal government pays for emergency Medicaid, right? But at the end of the day, the states will now have to burn a little bit more of the money that goes toward emergency Medicaid, but the money still has to get paid. People still have to get treated at the hospital. So the states are now, and this is not just in healthcare, but this is in a lot of different areas where we're seeing states taking on more and more of a burden and the federal government sort of withdrawing from a lot of these efforts, right? And so we see that in healthcare. Even with, there are programs, certain states that do provide healthcare for undocumented people through separate Medicaid type programs, right? Like California being the biggest example. DC, a few other states, blue states. So you can get healthcare if you're eligible for Medicaid through places in California, right? And that's been a big source of consternation for Republicans who believe that should not happen, right? But what's happening now is because there's budget crunches, because the states are getting so much less money from the feds, now some of these states are starting to pull back spending on some of these programs, right? So it's going to tax the existing healthcare infrastructure that much more, the community clinics that much more. Community clinics are facing a lot fewer dollars from Washington and from their state capitals. So it's going to sort of like start trickling down, and that's when we're going to start seeing, more emergency room visits, more people suffering conditions because, there's just less, it's just greater barriers to getting care.
Look, I'd be remiss in talking to a health reporter and not asking about the plight of what Americans, citizens who are on the exchanges are starting to experience. They're getting these notices. How significant of an increase are most Americans likely to see in their premiums with what's happening right now?
If the subsidies are not extended, it's going to be quite hefty. And particularly, there's another story that I did a week before the story that we're talking about today on how Republican states are actually going to really suffer a lot with the subsidies not being extended. So here in Miami, where I live, it's a red county now. It's a place that has backed Trump, and particularly among immigrant groups, many of them have backed Trump. But at the same time, a lot of those people here in Hialeah, where I'm close to, is a very, very Cuban American stronghold that is very, very supportive of Trump. But they are also one of the leading areas, zip codes for Obamacare enrollment, and their premiums are going to go through the roof. Republicans have really recognized that this is a problem because a lot of their constituents are going to see their healthcare costs go up a lot. So it affects everybody. It affects everybody, and I think even in the private markets, right, we're seeing employer-backed health plans going up as well. So this is something that it's sort of like, we're all going to see these prices go up next year, and really that's something that none of us can avoid.
David Ovalle of the Washington Post, health and science reporter. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.